Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are stories hidden in the cracks of America's past, stories whispered in backwoods towns, locked away in dusty courthouses, and buried beneath the silence of families who swore never to speak again. Tonight, you've stumbled into one of those stories. A tale so disturbing, so unrelenting, that even the people who lived through it pretended it never happened. Imagine this: a child, pale and sickly, born in a shack at the edge of the Appalachian woods. The neighbors don't speak of her. They don't even whisper her name. Because this was no ordinary child. She was born from her own brother, her mother's brother, America's most inbred baby. And yet, this isn't just about one child. This is about the way entire communities were swallowed whole by secrecy, shame, and cycles that could not be broken. When you peel back the curtain on one life, you uncover the weight of generations. Families forgotten, histories erased, and a darkness so persistent it begins to feel like destiny. The story begins in rural America, during a time when the world seemed so far away from these isolated hollows and hills. Out here, survival mattered more than reputation, and bloodlines twisted inward as families clung to themselves for safety, for pride, for survival. No outsiders, no fresh blood. Only the same names repeating over and over again, until even the children carried the weight of the past in their eyes. This child, the one they would later call the mistake of the mountains, was born into this silence. Her birth wasn't celebrated, it wasn't announced. Instead, it was concealed behind closed doors, with only the midwife and the family themselves bearing witness. And when she cried, it wasn't the cry of new life echoing into the world. It was the echo of something much older, much darker, reverberating through generations. Most towns pretend they don't have skeletons like this in their closets, but if you look long enough, if you dig deep enough, you'll find that some closets were built entirely of bones. This is the story of one of those closets, and the child who should never have been born. The mother of the child was no ordinary woman. She was young, only in her late teens when the whispers began. In those hills, isolation meant that choices were scarce, but the truth was far more disturbing than necessity. Her own brother, older by a handful of years, had become both her protector and her captor. And in a home where boundaries were blurred by generations of secrecy, what was forbidden elsewhere became normalized in silence. The townspeople knew something was wrong long before the baby was born. They saw the way she avoided eye contact at church. They saw the way he followed too closely, how his hand lingered on her arm in ways that didn't look like brotherly protection. But in a community where family ties ran deeper than law, and where shame was more powerful than justice, no one spoke. They watched, but they did not interfere. To speak it out loud would mean acknowledging that such corruption of blood ran through their own kind. When the girl's stomach began to swell, excuses were made. She had fallen ill. She was eating too much bread. Rumors spread like smoke, but no one dared name the fire. And when the day finally came, the screams of labor were muffled behind walls built as much from wood as from silence. The baby came into the world on a bed stained with secrecy, and the family braced themselves for the eyes of the community. The child's arrival was a shock even to those who thought they were prepared. She was small, frail, with features that didn't align quite right. The midwife who delivered her refused to return to the cabin again, claiming that she felt the hand of something unnatural in that room. The whispers that had circled the girl now turned into something sharper, something cutting, yet still no one named the truth. The family retreated further into themselves. They stopped attending gatherings. The girl's brother, the child's father, became more aggressive, as though the walls closing in on their secret drove him to deeper cruelty. The child, fragile and unknowing, became the living evidence of a bond that never should have been formed. And so the baby grew in the shadows, hidden but not invisible, because no matter how hard they tried to conceal her, the community could not help but see. And as the child grew, her existence became a silent fracture in the fabric of the town. She could not be ignored, yet she could never be accepted. The neighbors gave her names: the shadow baby, the cursed child, and sometimes, when they thought no one was listening, the brother's daughter. Each name carried with it not just cruelty, but the truth they refused to confront outright. Her health was fragile from the start. She was prone to fevers that burned for days, leaving her weak and trembling. Her legs did not grow as strong as other children's, and her speech came late, her words broken and uneven. The other children of the town would point and laugh, but beneath their laughter was fear. They had been warned in whispers from their parents to keep their distance, not because she was dangerous, but because she was a reminder of what could happen when the rules of blood were broken. The mother, barely more than a girl herself, grew thin and hollow-eyed. She carried the shame like a second skin, and yet, in a cruel twist, she also carried an instinctive love for her child. It was a love she could never express openly, for every time she looked at the baby, she also saw her brother, the man who had taken everything from her, and who now walked around town with an unsettling pride, as though fathering a child through his own sister was a perverse mark of power rather than sin. There are no photographs of the child, at least none that have surfaced. But the oral accounts, passed down in hushed tones, remembered at family gatherings when the whiskey had loosened tongues, paint a chilling portrait. Eyes that seemed too wide, too knowing for her age, a face that bore the unmistakable resemblance to her uncle-father, and a silence, an eerie calm that hung around her presence like a veil. The townspeople began to weave stories around her. Some said she was cursed, born as punishment to the family for their sins. Others whispered that she was an omen, that wherever she went, tragedy followed. And in a way, they were right, because the story of this child was not just her own. It was the story of what happens when cycles of silence are allowed to repeat, unchecked, across generations. Every time she drew breath, she reminded the town of what they had chosen not to stop. The years that followed were not kind. Poverty wrapped itself around the family like a second curse, tightening with every passing season. The cabin where they lived began to rot from the inside out, the boards bending with age, the roof leaking under heavy rains. Neighbors claimed they could smell the decay before they even reached the path. And yet, no one dared step closer. The family had become untouchable, not through respect, but through revulsion. The child grew into a strange presence, neither fully accepted by her mother, nor acknowledged by her father-brother. He remained a shadow that drifted in and out of the home, his influence unmistakable, his cruelty spoken of only in fragments. Some nights, villagers reported hearing screams echoing from the woods. But by morning, the cabin stood silent, smoke curling from its chimney as if nothing had happened. The silence was more terrifying than the sound. By the time she was old enough to walk the dirt roads herself, the child had already become an outcast. Her appearance carried the unmistakable marks of inbreeding, a jaw that didn't sit quite right, eyes slightly uneven, limbs that moved with an awkward rhythm. But more unsettling than her body was her presence. Children avoided her not only out of instruction but out of instinct. They said she looked through you, not at you, as if she were peering into something you didn't want exposed. Her mother's grief deepened as the years stretched on. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was often in fragmented mutterings to herself, fragments of prayers mixed with apologies no one could understand. It was as if she lived with a ghost inside her, a haunting she could never exorcise. She knew what her daughter represented, not just shame, but a living testament to the way silence destroys. And still, the brother carried on as though he were untouchable. In those years, no law came knocking, no sheriff rode into the hollows demanding answers. This was America's forgotten corner, a place where family honor outweighed written codes, and where children like her were allowed to exist in plain sight, unacknowledged by authority, but impossible to erase. The child was alive, yes, but she was also a living secret, a breathing reminder of everything that was wrong in a town that insisted nothing was, and secrets like that do not remain buried forever. By the time the child reached adolescence, her story had already seeped into the folklore of the region. She wasn't spoken of in daylight, but at night, when lanterns burned low and adults thought children were asleep, her name slipped into conversations like a curse. For some, she was a living reminder of sin. For others, she was nothing more than a cautionary tale, proof of what happens when bloodlines twist back on themselves. Her presence haunted the town in ways they couldn't quite explain. Crops failed one year, and whispers blamed her. A barn fire swept through another homestead, and again the town pointed fingers, even though she was nowhere near it. Misfortune had become her shadow, whether real or imagined, and the community needed someone to bear their fear. She became that vessel. The most inbred baby, now grown into a troubled young girl, carried the weight of collective guilt that was never hers to bear. Her mother had become a hollow shell of herself, thin, weary, often seen wandering the woods barefoot, as if trying to lose herself between the trees. Some claimed she tried to confess once to a traveling preacher, but before she could finish, her brother dragged her back into silence. Others say she wanted to flee, to take her daughter and vanish, but the chains of shame and dependence kept her rooted in place. And then there was the brother, the father. By now, he was more feared than despised, a man who walked through town with a smirk that dared anyone to confront him. No one ever did. The law didn't touch him, the church ignored him, and the neighbors, though disgusted, had grown used to swallowing their unease. The silence stretched further, and the cycle deepened. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out? Or would you, like the others, have chosen silence? Because in stories like this, silence is never neutral. It becomes its own form of complicity, shaping lives as powerfully as any crime. And in this case, it shaped a girl who was never meant to exist, yet stood as the living truth of what happens when darkness is ignored instead of confronted. Her story was only beginning, but the shadows surrounding her, the older the girl became, the heavier the weight she carried. Her body, frail and unsteady, betrayed her origins, but it was her eyes that unsettled people most. They were wide, dark and unblinking, as if she had already seen too much for someone so young. Some neighbors swore she remembered everything, every whisper, every insult, every glance that turned away from her in disgust. She became the mirror that no one wanted to face, reflecting the sins of the town back at them. She lived in isolation, wandering the woods alone, speaking to no one except her mother. Her brother-father remained a violent presence, unpredictable and cruel. When he entered the cabin, voices dropped to silence, and the air seemed to thicken. There are accounts of him boasting in hushed tones at the general store, claiming he had made something no other man had made, his words dripping with pride that horrified even those too afraid to speak against him. The mother's health began to deteriorate. Years of carrying her secret, of enduring her brother's grip, had hollowed her body and spirit. She looked decades older than she was, her skin stretched thin, her eyes dim. Some said she tried to end her life more than once, but could not bring herself to leave her daughter behind. Others believed she stayed alive, only to shield her child from her brother's full control. The girl, now in her teenage years, bore all of this in silence. She had no voice in her own story, no agency over her life. To the town, she was not a person but a symbol, something to pity, to ridicule, to fear. And yet, some who glimpsed her alone in the woods spoke of a strange resilience. They described her singing softly to herself, or carving small symbols into tree bark, as though she were creating a private language no one else could understand. By then, outsiders had begun to hear whispers of the story. A traveling Mercier chant carried it to the next county. A schoolteacher, newly arrived, asked too many questions. The secret that had lived and festered in silence for so long was beginning to leak beyond the borders of the town, and once a story escapes the place it was meant to be buried, it begins to take on a life of its own. The girl was no longer just a shadow in the hollows. She was becoming a legend, and legends never stay quiet. The legend of the child born from her own brother did not end with her life. In fact, much of the story remains shrouded in fragments, pieced together from oral histories, court whispers, and the shadows of memory. Some say she never reached adulthood, that her frail body finally gave in to the weight of her bloodline. Others claim she lived long enough to become a quiet woman, forever wandering the edges of town, never marrying, never leaving behind her own children. Whichever account is true, one thing is certain: she carried with her the scars of choices she never made. What makes her story so haunting is not only the grotesque nature of her birth, but the silence that surrounded it. Dozens of people knew, neighbors, kin, pastors, lawmen. They saw, they heard, they whispered. And yet, no one spoke loud enough to stop it. The crime was not hidden. It was ignored. And in that silence, a child came into the world who bore the consequences of everyone else's fear. Generations later, descendants of the region still deny, still look away when her name surfaces. Old court records are missing, family Bibles have pages torn out, and yet the whispers persist, carried like smoke through time. Because stories like this cannot be fully buried. They linger in the soil, in the sagging cabins, in the uneasy glances of those who would rather forget. When people speak of America's dark past, they often point to wars, crimes, tragedies written in history books. But there is another history, one that is not written, one that is hidden in bloodlines, in broken homes, in children who never asked to be born, but who carry the weight of generations nonetheless. The girl born from her own brother is one of those histories, a story erased from official record, yet unforgettable to anyone who stumbles upon its fragments. And in remembering her, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. That sometimes the most disturbing stories are not the ones we invent, but the ones that were lived in silence, just beyond the edges of memory. And so she remains, half myth, half history. A child who should never have been, a reminder of how darkness grows, not from what is spoken, but from what is left unsaid.